Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to come talk to you in person in SAS. Last time I came and gave a seminar in SAS, it was 2020 over Zoom. So it's really awesome to be here in person, and hopefully I'll have a chance to connect with many of you at the reception afterwards. I'm also really excited because a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today was inspired by several of the people in this department. So I'm going to do some shameless shout outs. So sorry about that. This theme or my talk today was really born out of a presentation that I gave at the Gordon Research Conference in Movement Ecology a few months ago, where I was asked to give a talk on how animals decide where and when to move. And so that's going to be kind of the overarching theme of this talk that is kind of expanded out of that, with an additional twist of how we can then think about how animals decide where and when to move, and then how we can use that information and apply it towards conservation. So I like to start some of my talks out with a series of animations, which show how, whether in water, land, or air, organisms across our planet have to cope with incredible amounts of environmental variation, and how organisms respond to this variation can shape large-scale patterns, from how species are distributed across the planet, to how species interact with one another, to how species or populations persist over the long term. And we know that animal movement, or movement in general, is a key adaptation to environmental variation. And so in my lab, we're interested in how animals navigate such dynamic environments. And then, like I said, how we can use that basic science information and apply it towards conservation. So in my lab, we study the causes and consequences of animal movement across a range of taxa and systems. Today, I'm just going to be talking about one species, which are blue whales. And in thinking about the drivers of animal movement, the movement ecology framework was established by Natan et al. About a little over a decade ago. And it helps us with a great reference point for thinking about the drivers of animal movement. And so the framework really starts with two questions: why do animals move, and how do they move? And why animals move is influenced by an animal's internal state, like how hungry or afraid it is, as well as external factors like resource availability or predation risk or human disturbance. And then how animals move is influenced by its motion capacity, like whether it can swim, walk, or fly, as well as its navigation capacity, like how well an animal can sense its environment and process its environment. Then these things all come together to determine where and when animals move, which can then influence broader scale patterns like a movement path or a movement pattern. And how an animal chooses to move in response to environmental variation can have critical consequences for broader scale patterns of space use, survival, and reproduction. And then these things can have downstream impacts on things like population dynamics, community interactions, or even ecosystem processes or functions like pollination or seed dispersal. And so movement can be thought of as this important glue that connects environmental processes to ecological outcomes. And therefore, it's really important to understand what drives movement and how external factors like human disturbance might be influencing animal movements. But one thing that's frequently left out of this framework is scale dependency. So animal movements can be organized into hierarchical scales, from the individual movement step to behavioral phases like commuting or foraging, to broader scale movement patterns like dispersal or migration, all the way up to a lifetime track. And in order to really understand and ultimately conserve the movements that we see, we need to be considering how the factors that drive these movements might vary and integrate across these different spatiotemporal scales. So today I'm going to talk about a collection of work on blue whales, where we've tried to tease apart the different drivers of movement from spatiotemporal scales as fine as minutes and meters, all the way up to months and thousands of kilometers, as these animals navigate a vast and dynamic ocean. And through talking about a series of case studies, I'm going to highlight some work of early career researchers that I've had the pleasure of working with. And we'll specifically talk about drivers of where and when to forage, where and when to move during migration, where and when to initiate migration, and then how we can take that basic science information and then apply it to some conservation tools. And through looking at these different scales, we'll consider the roles of perception versus memory, physical cues, social cues, and the internal state in driving movement at these different scales. Okay, so let me introduce you to our hero species. Many of you are probably very familiar with blue whales because of Trevor Branch's work in the department. But for those who aren't, blue whales are really amazing creatures because they are the largest animals to ever exist on Earth, larger than any dinosaur that ever walked the planet. But they feed on some of the tiniest animals in the ocean, which are krill. And because of this, blue whales rely on finding extremely dense aggregations of krill patches in the ocean, where a single blue whale can consume over 8,000 pounds of krill in just one day. Blue whales are a globally distributed species that inhabit most of the world's oceans. And in the eastern North Pacific, we have a migratory population that breeds in the Costa Rica Dome, and then it migrates up to the coast of North America in the spring and summertime. And then it does really intensive foraging on lots and lots of dense krill that comes up in the spring and summer before they migrate down south to breed. And now we know that the ocean is an incredibly dynamic environment that's structured by these physical features here, like these eddies that can span hundreds of kilometers. And for those of you who remember Cameron Brown's work here when he was in the department, we know that these eddies can be really important hotspots for top predator foraging. But beyond those really big eddies, we also have much finer scale filaments and currents that occur on the order of maybe 1 to 10 kilometers. And these can also be really important for structuring ocean ecosystems. And so in working with a grad student at Stanford named James Falbush, we asked, how can predators effectively find prey in such a patchy and dynamic environment? And specifically, we're interested in the role of those really fine scale physical features. So prior work has shown that those really fine scale features can aggregate prey species. So perhaps diving predators like these whales might use those fine scale surface structures that are at the ocean surface as a cue for where to find prey below the ocean surface. But this has actually been very difficult to tackle in terms of actually being able to pinpoint whether this is a true relationship, because it requires collecting predator feeding events that occur at very short timescales and then matching them with environmental data at similarly short timespans. So to test this, we deployed high-resolution multi-sensor tags on blue whales in Southern California. And in addition to GPS units, these tags also carried video recorders and accelerometers. We could see exactly what the whales were doing. And then from this, we could get some really high-resolution data on exactly where these animals were going in the ocean and where and when they were feeding. So each of these little red dots is a feeding lunge. And as you can see, they tend to feed at much deeper depth during the daytime, and then they feed closer to the ocean surface at nighttime. But like I said, the challenge then was taking this high-resolution animal behavioral data and then matching it with environmental data at sufficiently high timescales. Because typically what we do when we're looking at big ocean currents or big eddies is we use satellite imagery, but satellite imagery gives us a snapshot of the ocean surface at best once a day. So James developed a really novel approach for this, which was to leverage the West Coast network of high-frequency radar stations, which measure ocean current and ocean speed and direction on an hourly basis. And so then he took these current estimates and that were measured by radar, and then using a computer simulation, he seeded a grid of particle tracers and then tracked them over time. Oh, I'm sorry, the video didn't show, but basically you can imagine a bunch of particles that are going like this in the ocean, and you can actually look at areas of aggregation where particles are going to be aggregated in the ocean based on the currents that are existing. And so then we translated this into a metric that we could actually use in our analysis, which is called the finite time Lyapunov exponent, or FTLE. And this is a measure of the rate of particle attraction in an area. So areas with really high FTLE in yellow are areas where there's really high aggregation, where we would expect to find that prey, that higher concentrations of prey. And so here is a blue whale that's foraging, and it's kind of switching in between feeding and non-feeding states. And this is just anecdotal, but this one individual stayed within this one aggregative feature for about 3 days, during which it traveled over 30 kilometers just to remain in that feature while it was foraging. And so statistically speaking, across all the individuals that we looked at, we found that blue whales preferentially selected for feeding when in higher FTLE areas. So here on the x-axis is FTLE, where higher FTLE means more aggregation. And on the y-axis is the probability of feeding. So there is error bars around here, but you can't really see them. And so not only did we find that blue whales were more likely to be feeding when in these areas of high aggregation, but they also had a much higher feeding rate. So they were lunging much, much more when they were in these aggregative features. And so we concluded that these fine scale physical features do facilitate feeding, and that this suggests that not only can these big broad scale eddies be important foraging hotspots for predators, but even these really fine scale physical features can help facilitate energy gain. And the ecological role of these physical structures is not only confined to marine systems, but also appears to be important in other dynamical systems as well. So for example, entomologists have long known that convergent features in the air can aggregate insects, but only recently, by putting high resolution GPS tags and accelerometers on flying predators like these pallid swifts here, has it been shown that predators can also take advantage of those convergent zones in the air to efficiently capture prey. And so we're in this exciting time now where, because of advancing technology, we're better able to match predator movements and prey movements with really fine scale physical structures that are occurring in these dynamic systems, and better understand how these animals are navigating and finding prey in such dynamic environments. So here at these very fine spatiotemporal scales, we saw an important role of direct physical cues in determining where and when animals foraged. But what about at broader scales, like during migration? So here we asked, how do animals navigating in dynamic environments maximize their resource gain? And so we can start with our classic definitions of migration. So whether we're talking about birds or butterflies or whales, the classic understanding of migration really focuses on the endpoints of distinct ranges for survival and reproduction. And so, for example, a classic definition of migration is large-scale return movement of a population, which occurs each year between regular breeding and wintering areas. So really focusing on those endpoints of migration. But then just in the last few years, theory has emerged that puts what happens along the migration route into the spotlight. And this theory really emerges from this idea that mobile animals can maximize their resource gain by tracking the availability of fleeting resources as they move across an environment. And so we can take, for example, a bear that forages for salmon at a river. And because the availability of salmon at that river is fleeting, work done by Daniel Schindler and others has shown that the bear can actually maximize its energy gain by moving from one river to the next to take advantage of the spatiotemporal heterogeneity in resource availability. And this theory about and this is called resource tracking, just more broadly. And this theory about resource tracking can help us understand where animals will be when across a landscape, and it can also help us anticipate how changes in the environment might affect animal movement patterns. So now we can scale this idea up to much broader spatial scales when we think about migratory species. So imagine that you have a landscape or seascape with a phenological gradient in when resources like food become available. So here in this image, the color is the day of the year that resources peak in each location. So you can imagine maybe a deer that's foraging for leaves across the landscape. And so here we might have resources peaking earlier in the year and then over here, and then later in the year over here. And then this migratory deer is going to spend its winter range earlier in the year over here, and then its summer range over here. And so this theory has shown, and a lot of papers have shown, that migrating animals can maximize their resource gain by tracking these resource waves when you have an ordered gradient of resource availability across a landscape. And in the context of migratory herbivores, where a lot of this theory about migratory species was developed, this is called the green wave hypothesis, because these animals, these herbivores, are tracking waves of spring green up across a landscape. Now, testing for resource tracking can actually be very straightforward in that, typically what you can do is compare the date of animal use of a location with a date of optimal resource availability in a location. And if an animal is perfectly surfing or tracking the resource wave, we'd see a 1-to-1 ratio. In reality, it looks a lot more like this because resource waves in natural environments are inherently very noisy. And just as an example from one of my colleagues, Ellen Akins, she shows mule deer tracking the waves of spring green up, and it roughly follows that 1-to-1 relationship, but there's a lot of noise around that. And this phenomenon of resource tracking is really important to understand, because if animals are tracking resource waves to maximize their fitness, then any changes in the phenologies of those waves might affect their survival and reproduction. And in fact, we've already seen this happen in many parts of the world. And as one really kind of classic example or striking example, in Europe, earlier emergence of caterpillars driven by climate change led to a mismatch with the migratory timing of pied flycatchers. And this led to a 90% decline in the pied flycatcher population over a 20-year period. So this can actually have very serious consequences for populations. There's been a huge proliferation of papers on this topic of resource tracking in recent years, but really notably, all of these papers, and pretty much everyone that had previously existed, had only been within terrestrial systems and almost exclusively on large herbivores, with very limited exception. And this seems like a pretty important knowledge gap, because in order to understand how widespread resource tracking might be as an overarching driver of migration, it needs to be tested in a broader range of systems. And I was particularly interested in seeing whether this occurred in marine systems as well. So why might this not have been tested in marine systems? Well, if we look at a resource landscape in an ecosystem like the African savanna, which is where I do a lot of field work, particularly on African wild dogs, which I showed you a photo of at the beginning. I'm not really going to talk about that today. We see a really obvious change in resource distribution from one season to the next. So those photos were taken about 3 months apart. And then if we look into the open ocean, we might see something like this, which appears completely devoid of life. And then 3 months later, we might see the same thing. But then maybe an hour later, we might see a scene like this, right? So there's so much dynamism in marine environments that we just don't see as much in terrestrial environments. And because of this, resource waves in the marine environment are likely to be very noisy and difficult to detect. And then in addition, resource waves are most often characterized or quantified based on satellite imagery. But this can be really problematic in marine systems. One, because it's not going to capture, it only captures primary productivity. So it's not really going to capture the distribution of resources like krill or fish that predators are eating. And it's only going to capture what's happening at the ocean surface. So it's not really going to capture what's happening below the ocean surface for diving predators. But we suspected that this blue whale system along the West Coast would be a good system for testing resource tracking in, because there actually is a really nice wave of productivity that occurs along the spring and summer, which is roughly when those whales are migrating up the coast. And this is driven by seasonal coastal upwelling. And so here are the colors denote the day of the year that primary production peaks in each grid cell. And so lighter colors are peaking earlier in the year, and then later, darker colors, bluer colors are peaking later in the year. And so what we see is that lower latitudes, we have peaks earlier, and then at higher latitudes, we have peaks later, and this creates this nice kind of ordered gradient in a wave-like fashion. So to test whether blue whales were tracking this resource wave, we compiled daily values of chlorophyll A. We lagged this by a month, which was what both the literature and also our kind of sensitivity analyses told us was the best kind of proxy for krill production. And then we also compiled daily values of sea surface temperature, and we calculated when these kind of resources peaked in each location and the timing of those peaks. And then we compared the timing of those resource peaks with the timing of whale arrival in each location from 10,000 blue whale locations that we collected, my collaborators collected from satellite telemetry. And we also modeled or simulated random migration tracks. So the blue is the empirical tracks from the GPS data. And then the red are simulated tracks because we also wanted to test a null hypothesis in which any observed relationships between whale arrival and the environment might simply be byproducts of latitudinal migratory behavior that's actually totally decoupled from what the environment is doing. So did blue whales track green waves? So here, again, we would expect to see a one-to-one, roughly a one-to-one relationship if they were tracking these resource waves well. And here, these are the linear regression estimates for each year. And blue is the actual tracks and red is the simulated tracks. And the moral of the story is that no, we didn't find any evidence. There was no correlation between whale arrival and what was actually happening in the ocean in real time. But I've left out a really important element of this system, which is that there's really strong interannual variability in these resource waves. So the image that I had shown you previously is actually the 10-year average, where you see this really nice kind of ordered gradient. But then if you look at the timing of productivity in any given year, you actually see way more noise and way more variation from year to year, which might make it hard for these animals to actually follow the optimal kind of movement steps of where they might be able to track resources the best as they're kind of migrating up the coast. So how might animals cope with this variability? Well, in the last decade or so, there's been an increased research attention on the role of memory in animal movement. So there's been a bunch of papers recently that have shown that memory can enhance foraging efficiency. So it can help animals remember the best paths that lead to high quality resource areas. And then in the context of migration, memory can really provide two major benefits. One is it can enhance an animal's perceptual range. So just based on memory, animals can remember kind of where in the vicinity they might be able to find good food. And then it also allows them to forecast conditions further along the migratory route based on their experience of past conditions. But the value of memory can really depend on the degree of spatiotemporal variability within a system. And so Fagan and colleagues showed that in landscapes or seascapes that are completely homogeneous, or conversely, if they're completely unpredictable, memory doesn't really add that much value. But then there's a kind of sweet spot in the middle of intermediate predictability where memory can be extremely valuable. So we hypothesized that perhaps these animals were using some degree of memory to track that long-term average resource wave. Because these animals do live up to 90 years old and they're performing these migrations each and every year. And so we thought that maybe they have accumulated some knowledge of what's going on along the migration path that they might be able to use to optimize their movements to cope with that level of interannual variability. And so to test this, we compared the date of blue whale use in each location to the long-term average date of peak productivity. And so did blue whales track the long-term green wave? Well, we found that the empirical whale tracks, these blue dots in the blue regression line, really closely matched this one-to-one ratio. that we would expect, but the simulated tracks did not, which means this isn't just a random byproduct of that latitudinal migratory behavior. So we found that, yes, these whales are tracking this long-term green wave, which suggests that a memory-based movement mechanism may be at play here. And if that is the case, then we would predict that these whales would be using predictable foraging hotspots from year to year. Like they would go back to the exact same places year after year to feed. And so to look at that question, we used a state space model to identify putative foraging locations. And we found that blue whales did selectively forage in areas with high long-term productivity compared to what was immediately profitable to them. And then they also selected for areas with really low interannual variability or high predictability from year to year. So taken together, we did find evidence for a memory-based movement mechanism that may allow these animals to exploit predictable resource peaks en route during migration. And this might be a valuable strategy for coping with the level of interannual variability in the system. But it does also raise a conservation question, which is, can these animals adjust their timing in response to changes in phenology that might be driven by climate change? And that's something that we're starting to see and we're starting to investigate. And so finally, at the broadest scale, we can now ask, what cues do these whales use to decide where and when to initiate migration in the first place? And this work was led by my mentees, Will Astrike at Mbari, Steph Dodson at Colby College, and Kano Al at Stanford University. And so we know that many organisms use fixed cues like day length to time major life history transitions like breeding or migration onset. But other species may use flexible cues like climate, like how warm the temperature is, or resource availability to time those life history events. And so, for example, my collaborators and I recently showed that temperature was a really important predictor of the timing of breeding in African wild dogs. Not much was known about what cues these whales use to terminate that foraging that occurs along the West Coast and then initiate that southward migration to breed, because there just hadn't been very much data collected in that part of their life history. But one really cool way to study whale presence and whale behavior is to eavesdrop on them. And I know that there are some really cool acoustic research that's going on whales in this department. So blue whales make a variety of calls that sound like this. We'll see if, I think it's not playing very loudly. Okay. Can you hear a little whisper? Okay. And a hydrophone has been listening out for blue whales in Monterey Bay, which is one of their main foraging hotspots along the West Coast, continuously since 2015. And so a couple of years ago, Will made a really cool discovery, which is that those whale calls actually carry information about the whale's behavioral states. So when whales are actively foraging, they're calling more during the night. But when they have when they're all finished with foraging and they've transitioned to migrating southward, they call more during the daytime. And so we can use the ratio of daytime to nighttime calling to estimate the population level transition from foraging to breeding migration. And so we use that information to ask whether breeding migration timing is fixed or whether it's flexible in response to oceanographic conditions. And so if we just look at when whales are present in Monterey Bay based on the detection of those calls, it's pretty consistent from year to year between September and December, roughly. But then if we look at the behavioral transition from foraging to breeding migration, which are the red dots, we see that there's a lot more interannual variability. And so, for example, in 2015, the population as a whole generally migrated beginning in September. And in 2020, it didn't start migrating until December. So we saw about a 4-month time span of flexibility in when these whales would begin to migrate south. But the important thing here is that this was only evident when we considered that behavioral transition, not just whether whales were present or not. So then we asked, if there's variation in when whales are migrating south, is this tied to ecosystem phenology in any way? And we actually found a really strong correlation with ecosystem phenology, where whales would initiate their migrations later in years with later peaks in productivity. So given that the whale calls were really integral to detecting that flexible life history transition, it led us to ask the question, does social communication improve migration timing in response to environmental variability? And we know from an extensive literature, including some led by Andrew Birdall here in SAFS, that social information can be used very heavily in animal movement decision-making. And so all of these studies I'm showing here really focus on the role of social cues in a spatial context like navigation, but we were also interested in looking at how prevalent is it that social cues are used in migration timing, not just the spatial component. And so I worked with Will and Kano and Andrew and others to review the literature on the use of social cues in migration timing specifically. And we found a lot of evidence of the use of social cues across taxa in migration timing, ranging from really explicit cues like active calling, all the way to completely implicit cues like the presence of conspecifics. And so just to give two examples, Andrew and Tom Quinn showed that leader-follower dynamics can help explain the pulsed timing of salmon spawning migrations. And then as another example, Sarah Converse and I, along with others, showed that in migratory whooping cranes, young birds who are just learning to migrate rely very heavily on older birds to time their migrations. But then as those young birds age and grow themselves and collect their own kind of personal information and personal experience, they rely increasingly on their own personal information to time their migrations. So as I said, we found a lot of evidence across a variety of taxa, from insects to salamanders to whales, of the use of social cues in migration timing. But importantly, what was interesting is that we actually found relatively little evidence of whether there's an adaptive value of that social information. And so, as I said, we were really interested in asking, does social communication improve migration timing, specifically in response to environmental variability? But to test whether this is true, whether social information can actually lead to more adaptive migration timing, we can't really easily do experiments on blue whales. And so one thing we can do is we can compare simulated decision-making with actual empirical observed reality. And this is where agent-based modeling can come in as really valuable, because what we can do is we can give a whole bunch of individual agents individual decision rules that align with what we think are the processes that are driving their movements. So we're basically enabling these to kind of play out some hypotheses that we think are happening in this system. And then we can look at the emergent population behavior and then compare what this emergent behavior is to what we actually see in the wild. And this modeling approach has some nice features to it because there's a number of flexible modeling options. So for example, we can have multiple individuals transitioning between different behavioral states. We can give different individuals in the population different decision rules. And we can also allow individuals to interact with one another. So Steph Dodson and myself and others a few years ago had previously published an agent-based model for blue whales that considered a whale's own personal information on what the prey availability was in its environment, as well as what the oceanographic conditions are, and use that information to help inform whether the whale is going to continue foraging or whether it's going to initiate its migration southward. And so this is kind of what that looks like. I know it looks a little insane, but basically these are a whole bunch of agents that are moving around and eating krill, and they're transitioning between 4 different behavioral states, moving northward, moving southward, foraging, and foraging in the north and foraging in the south. And you can see how eventually all of these agents end up migrating southward. And so based on the decision rules that we can give it, we can start to interrogate that timing of that southward migration. And so now we took that original agent-based model and we added social communication into the mix. where calling whales can transmit a measure of their daily foraging success. And then each individual whale within the call radius of other whales can average all those signals together and then use that information to probabilistically inform whether to continue to forage or to initiate migration. And so we can use these models to test different mechanisms for how whales initiate their southward migrations. So we ran a model that only used personal information. And so in this scenario, whales would have a higher probability of migrating if they aren't finding krill. Then we also ran a model that included social information. So there would be a higher probability of migrating if a whale is receiving calls from other whales that indicate that they are also having poor foraging success. And then we also compared these to two null models. One that was a fixed day of the year. So whales are migrating at the same day of the year every single year. And then a second one, which is completely hypothetical, which is if the whales never migrated. And the reason why we were interested in that was just to see what's kind of the maximum amount of food these animals can get if they were never to leave the California current. And so we used two metrics to compare these models. First was the timing of the collective migration, which we can then compare to actual observed timing of migration in the population, and then the total prey intake of each whale. So if we look at the timing of collective migration, here on the y-axis is the day of the year that the population as a whole is initiating migration. And this gray box plot is hydrophone data. So that's the actual observed timing of when whales initiated their migrations. And we can see that the model with just the personal information led to migration timings that were much too early. But then if we include social information into that model, it aligns much better and leads to much more realistic late season migrations. And what this social information is effectively doing is it's effectively expanding the perceptual range of the whale from not just what it itself is experiencing, but also what all of its conspecifics are experiencing within a particular radius. And then similarly, the model that included social information, which is this green color, led to higher prey intake for all of the whales across the board in every year that we looked at. And this was true even in conditions with very low prey availability, as well as high prey availability. So we concluded here that social communication can maintain high prey intake in dynamic prey conditions. And so these results suggest that personal information alone could not replicate what we actually observe in nature in terms of the whale's migratory timing, and that social information can be valuable in enabling migration to be more responsive to dynamic prey conditions. And so the last part of my talk is going to focus on conservation and how we can take all those kind of basic science components together and then apply it to a major conservation problem, which is whale-ship collisions. So blue whales are a globally endangered species, and in most parts of the world, collisions with shipping vessels are a major conservation threat. And on the US West Coast, the current estimate of ship strikes to blue whales specifically is 10 times higher than what the federal government deems sustainable for the population. So this is a really big issue. And so why might this be? Well, as you can see from these maps, we get really high spatial overlap between shipping traffic that's coming into two of the busiest ports of the US West Coast. And this aligns almost perfectly with some hotspots of blue whale foraging habitat. And the biggest hotspot for ship strikes on the West Coast is the Santa Barbara Channel, where you can see that the shipping lanes that are coming into the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach almost perfectly bisect some really prime whale habitat where a lot of whales are observed. And so because of this, every single year we see whale ship collisions. And so this is a graph of the number of recorded whale ship collisions on the coast of California. One thing to note is that this is a huge underestimate because the vast majority of whale ship collisions go undocumented because either the carcass falls to the ocean floor or it's carried by a current somewhere else and it's never recorded. Another thing that's notable about this is that the years 2018, 2019, and 21 were the worst years on record in California for whale ship collisions. And we actually have no idea why. But it certainly shows that this problem isn't really going away. But thankfully, we do know that a very effective solution is for ships to slow down to below 10 knots when in the presence of whales. And this has been shown to significantly reduce the likelihood of a fatal collision with a whale. But a major challenge with this is that despite these whales being the largest animals to ever exist, they're completely dwarfed by these shipping containers. And so these vessels usually don't even know that whales are in the vicinity. So why would they know to slow down, right? So to address this, we applied our knowledge of all the different factors that we knew influenced blue whale space use and the timing of their migrations. And we built dynamic distribution models to help us predict where whales are going to be along the West Coast. And so we used tracking data from satellite telemetry, and we used machine learning models to relate this to three-dimensional daily oceanographic conditions on things like FTLE that I mentioned earlier in the talk, chlorophyll, sea surface temperature, and a number of other factors. And then we developed our models and we compared them and validated them using a large compilation of independent sightings data. And so what we get is like a weather forecast for whales that helps predict the probability of blue whale presence along the West Coast on any given day of the year based on that day's oceanographic conditions. And this is actually, these models are spitting out predictions in real time. So anyone can go to CoastWatch, NOAA's CoastWatch server, and see, for example, today's West Coast whale predictions. And what's notable about this is that just based on oceanographic conditions alone, we're actually able to recreate the latitudinal migratory behavior of this population. So then we worked with a large consortium of collaborators led by the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory to integrate that model into a real-time decision support tool called WhaleSafe to help reduce ship strikes. And so what WhaleSafe does is it pulls in all those daily real-time habitat predictions for whales, as well as sightings detections and acoustic detections from a buoy that's deployed in the Santa Barbara Channel. And it brings all that together and creates this whale presence rating, which is kind of like a Smokey the Bear risk rating. That's the risk of whale presence in this area. And then it communicates that risk rating to transiting ships so that they know when to slow down when in high risk areas. And so WhaleSafe has been deployed in the Santa Barbara Channel as well as the San Francisco Bay Area. Anyone can go to whalesafe.com and see today's whale presence rating, which ranges from very high in Santa Barbara to medium in San Francisco. And then another thing that WhaleSafe does is it monitors vessel compliance with that 10-knot speed limit. So it pulls in real-time AIS data that shipping vessels are mandated to have when they're above a certain size. And then it can calculate how well it's complying with that speed limit and then gives these shipping report cards. So anyone can go to WhaleSafe and see like which companies are deemed the most, quote, whale safe. And now this needs to be taken with a very large grain of salt because we haven't run any kind of formal analysis on this yet. But we have seen an increase in vessel compliance with that speed limit since WhaleSafe was first implemented in 2020, which at least gives us some reason for optimism. But whale ship collisions are not just an issue on the West Coast. It's actually a worldwide problem. And marine shipping is a really behemoth industry. So, and as you can see, it really touches most of the world's oceans. And a really interesting fact is that 90% of the goods that we consume here in the United States have traveled on one of these shipping containers at some point in their life cycle. And this industry is also rapidly growing, where global maritime traffic is projected to increase up to 10-fold over the next 25 years. One of the first steps in addressing this problem is to understand where whales are most at risk in the ocean, because we need to be able to prioritize where to focus our conservation efforts. But actually, for the vast majority of the world's oceans, we have no idea what the level of risk is for whales. And so my postdoc, Anna Nisi, is working on developing dynamic global distribution models for 4 globally distributed great whale species that have been identified as being most at risk of ship strike. And then she's building these dynamic whale distribution models and then overlaying them with shipping traffic so we can get these global maps of collision risk. And so this is very much still under construction, but we're working with the Nature Conservancy as well as NOAA and other partners to then use these maps to expand ship strike mitigation efforts. Like, for example, implementing incentive programs for ships to slow down in high-risk areas that are identified from these maps. Okay, my last slide of the talk is just to conclude, which is that we can see how the drivers of migration and animal movement in general can be highly scale dependent and can be very complex, ranging from environmental cues to memory to social cues, personal information, social information, and how all these different factors can drive the movements of these whales as they navigate such vast and dynamic environments. And then finally, the last point I want to make is that even though some of these questions that we're asking seem very, very basic, a lot of the science that we do really can have applied applications to conservation tools, and the intersection of that is what really excites me. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and the many, many people without whom this work wouldn't have been possible. And thank you for your attention.
Great, I'll let you drive and grab anyone for questions.
The striped shirt? Yes, that's you. Yes.
Okay. I thought it was cool how the whales are using communication to project where there's abundance of prey. That's a driver of when to migrate. Have you thought about that as a mechanism for the migration, for sort of establishing a migration path dynamically versus just historic memory?
That's a really great question. We have not at all looked at that, and I think it's possible given the tracking data that we have, and at least we could probably also potentially model that with an agent-based approach. But I do know, like, there was a famous study that was done on whooping cranes, for example, that showed that that kind of social communication, social learning helped create a more optimal migratory route for these whooping cranes. And given the fact that these whales are calling constantly, I wouldn't be surprised if there were similar dynamics going on. Yeah, it's a great question. Daniel?
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious what the adaptive reason for calling to your competitors about where the food is.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't, so they do migrate collectively, and I think that there must be some value in that collective migration, whether it might be for all arriving on the breeding grounds at the same time or protecting young. Like, you do see really dense aggregations of blue whales showing up. That might, for the most part, adults are not predated on by anything, but the young are predated on by, like, killer whales, for example. So I don't know that it is only competition. But one thing that is also interesting that I didn't really go into is that we think that this kind of messaging of foraging efficiency might actually be kind of secondary. Like, they mostly are calling, we think they're mostly calling for mating reasons, but because there's such a strong signature in the timing of their calling and the fact that they basically stop calling during the day when they're all done eating, it might be more like unintentional messaging.
Perfect.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I'm over here and then I'll move over there. Yes.
Is there any evidence for DNA as opposed to memory?
Like, as in
Monarch butterflies.
Oh, I guess one question that we one thing that could be happening is like cultural transmission between like offspring and young. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Or are you thinking
Hardwired.
oh, hardwired. I don't think it's hardwired because it is so closely aligned with the timing of the productivity. It would make a lot more sense if it was something like time of day or time of year, where you might see the same thing every single year. But because there's such fine scale movements where they're going to this spot and then this spot and then this spot, it seems like, and those spots are the spots that they're going to are these extremely predictable foraging hotspots. I think it's more likely to be that they're remembering as opposed, but it's a good hypothesis to consider. Yes, there were questions over here. Yes, in the back.
Great talk. I had a question about the shipping lane on the Channel Island. Other than the slowdown, have there been any efforts to divert the shipping lane on the outside of the Channel Island?
Yeah, great question. So there's two things. One is that on the other side of the Channel Islands, the Navy does a lot of their testing, and they are very, very opposed to, so it has been considered, but they are very opposed to any shipping lanes going through their like testing areas. And then the other aspect of it is that all those dots that I showed you are from whale watching tours that tend to be on the inland part of the Channel Islands because that's just where people are. But actually whales do use the other side of the Channel Islands as well. Yeah, so there was actually a study done that did compare the risk of ship strike according to a whole bunch of different options, including moving the shipping lanes. But it basically concluded that the best thing to do would just be to have ships slow down. Yes, yes.
Yeah, so that whale statement was super cool. That's really awesome. So I kind of have a two-part question. First question is, so if the whales are following these small scale movements, is it also reasonable to think that some fishery, some fish there that are targets in the fishery are also following those
Oh.
to the areas?
I mean, yes, in that this is not my area of expertise, but like, yeah, if there are things that are eating krill or eating nekton, then yeah, you would certainly expect. And actually, I didn't talk about it at all, but I did do a separate study on elephant seals that are diving like 500 meters below depth, way out in like the pelagic zone of the ocean. And they are very strongly also selecting for these like FTLE features, and they're eating like squid and fish. So it does suggest that it does kind of cascade to higher orders in those aggregation zones as well.
So, so along those lines, I guess my question is, if that's the case, is there any tracking on whether or not, say, like commercial fishing vessels are also looking at this website? Because I mean, it's a really cool thing, right? You're using ship strikes, but I could also see different industries coming in and saying, oh, the whales are going to be there, which means the fish are going to be there, which might increase the chance of interactions and other things. Right?
It's really interesting, and I honestly hadn't thought about it, but there is a paper that I believe was led out of the Northwest Fisheries Science Center that did show that fishermen do select for these aggregation features as well when they're fishing. So you know, they know what's up on the water. Yeah.
It might be an interesting tool to be able to track their behavior change too, if they have, like, that's a really cool tool to be able to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll have to talk to some fisheries folks. Yeah. Yes.
I'm a whale question, but I know one of the species you were looking at was the penguin. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, sure. So I'm in the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels, and the other, let's see, is this on here? Yes. And the other professor who founded it is Dee Boersma, who has been studying Magellanic penguins in Argentina since the 1980s and has been collecting this incredible long-term data set on penguin behavior, penguin demographics, population trends. And so that has always focused a little bit more on kind of the like basic behavior questions. And what some folks in my lab are doing is now looking at how like long-term climate change and climate extremes have been affecting things like demographic rates and population growth, and also looking at some things like behavioral plasticity and the role that can play in buffering the population against some of the environmental changes that are going on. So, yeah. I haven't developed a talk about that yet.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so why do the blue whales signal more to each other during like the night foraging?
You know, I don't think it's that they're signaling more. It's just that the timing of when they're signaling changes during when they're foraging versus when they're migrating. So when they're foraging, they're basically so active during the daytime when they're foraging that they reserve their singing to the nighttime. And then when they're all done foraging and they're migrating, then they start singing a lot more during the daytime as they're kind of just like swimming along. The role of the kind of dynamics of those social communication calls is really understudied. So we don't fully understand all of the reasoning behind the patterns that we see, but it is really cool that we can kind of detect that transition just through the ratio of the daytime to nighttime calling. Yes.
Thanks very much for the talk. I've been wondering the whole time, I don't know much about whales, but firstly, is it mandatory for them to migrate? And then secondly, how do you change the models to be able to work out what the drivers would be for not migrating in some of the whales, because that is becoming more and more prevalent in the many of these species these days.
Yeah. I suspect that they are obligate. So there are populations of blue whales in other parts of the world that are non-migratory. I suspect that it has a lot to do with the dynamics of the ecosystem. So like how much seasonal change that there is. In this system, there's obviously these really strong seasonal changes where parts of the year are not very productive. And then in the spring and summertime, there's just this huge boom of productivity. And because they are, I always confuse these capital breeders. So they're putting on a whole bunch of weight. They're going up and foraging. They're putting on tons and tons of weight during this intensive foraging season, and they're migrating back down and breeding. I don't think that there is sufficient prey availability year round in their breeding habitat to be able to support their life cycle essentially. So I think in this system, it's necessary, but I think the way we could interrogate that is we could play around with the kind of oceanographic dynamics that are underlying the models that we're fitting, and maybe create oceanographic dynamics that aren't as seasonal, and then see if they basically stop migrating from that. I would love to do a comparative analysis across populations of blue whales and compare the oceanographic dynamics in these populations that are migratory versus resident. It's just, yeah, a matter of time.
Last one.
Is there a con for the ships slowing down and the point where the population becomes large enough where the current amount of ship strikes is sustainable?
Sorry, I am in my second trimester and I just got very lightheaded. Your question was, is there a con for ships slowing down? You mean a con from the whale perspective?
Or like any other perspective, department, ecosystem, if a ship's slowing down, it can kill another animal better or something like that.
Oh yeah, no, it's great to think about that. So there's actually other huge pros of whales, ships slowing down in terms of there's reduced carbon emissions and reduced pollution when they travel slower. So actually Southern California has a program called Blue Whales, Blue Skies, and it's basically incentivizing ships to slow down, both to protect blue whales, but also to protect blue skies, because that's actually the pollution from these shipping vessels is actually a big problem for some of these port cities. But whether there is any negative impacts on other species from ships slowing down, yeah, I have no idea. It's a great question. I would suspect that it would generally be positive because when ships are moving slower, they're not emitting as much noise, and we also know that noise pollution is a huge issue.